When society fears to acknowledge the true nature of female desire, it's not protecting virtue, it's perpetuating ignorance. The most dangerous taboos are those we refuse to name, for in silence, they gain power over us. Dr. Elizabeth Thornhill. Why does female desire provoke such profound discomfort in our society? It's not the romanticized version from fairy tales. It's not the predictable affection society endorses. It's something deeper, more primal, and far less acknowledged. Within female desire lies an impulse that unsettles even the most composed individuals. When Sigmund Freud attempted to articulate this reality, he became a target of dismissal and ostracism. What he uncovered wasn't comforting or pretty, but it was authentic, and that authenticity remains concealed from those who cling to the belief that desire is merely tenderness and affection. In this video, we'll unveil what has been concealed, confront what few dare to acknowledge, and understand why certain truths about female desire are so challenging to accept, especially for those who believe they've already deciphered it. The late 19th century was dominated by corsets, propriety, and rigid sexual norms. Women were idealized as pure, virtuous beings with minimal sexual desire. Then emerged Sigmund Freud, a young neurologist with revolutionary ideas that would shatter this comfortable illusion. When Freud began treating women diagnosed with hysteria in Vienna, what he discovered beneath their symptoms was shocking. These weren't merely nervous disorders. They were manifestations of repressed sexual energy so powerful that when denied expression, it transformed into physical symptoms. The respectable Victorian lady, it appeared, harbored desires as intense as any man's. This revelation was revolutionary. Freud's earliest case studies, Anna O., Elizabeth von R., Dora, revealed women whose sexual desires had been so thoroughly suppressed that their bodies rebelled. These weren't isolated anomalies. They represented a pattern suggesting female sexuality wasn't the docile, passive force society portrayed. It was wild, demanding, and potentially devastating when denied. The Victorian establishment reacted with horror. Medical journals rejected his papers. Colleagues distanced themselves. Society women whispered scandalized gossip about the doctor, who dared suggest they possessed sexual desires comparable to men's. But what truly disturbed them wasn't just the idea that women wanted sex. It was what they wanted and why. Freud proposed that women's desires were complex, often contradictory, and tied to deep psychological needs that society refused to acknowledge. The female libido wasn't simply about reproduction or pleasing men. It had its own agenda, its own dark corners, its own demanding nature. Women could desire submission, dominance, or even pain as part of their sexual expression. They could harbor incestuous longings, aggressive impulses, and narcissistic fantasies. Perhaps most threatening was Freud's insistence that these desires began in childhood. The innocent little girl wasn't so innocent after all. She experienced sexual pleasure from infancy, developed complex feelings toward both parents, and navigated psychological storms that would shape her adult sexuality. This meant female desire wasn't something that could be controlled by proper upbringing. It was fundamental, primal, and inevitable. The scandal wasn't just that Freud acknowledged female desire. Others had done that, albeit in hushed tones. The true scandal was that he exposed its raw, unrefined nature. His patients revealed fantasies of seduction, violence, and submission that directly contradicted the Victorian ideal of feminine purity. When women were allowed to speak freely, on his couch what emerged wasn't gentle romanticism, but primal urges that society had no framework to accept. Society's response was predictable: deny, dismiss, and discredit. Medical establishments labeled Freud a pervert, projecting his own deviancy onto innocent women. Religious authorities condemned him for undermining moral values. Even early feminists fighting for women's rights found his theories problematic. They were working to elevate women's status, not expose their supposedly base desires. What made Freud's ideas so dangerous was their explanatory power. His patients improved when they acknowledged these forbidden desires. Their symptoms receded when they confronted what society told them they shouldn't want. This clinical success suggested he had uncovered something real, something that couldn't be dismissed as mere theory. The Victorian era couldn't reconcile itself with these revelations. The idealized woman, maternal, pure, devoted, was fundamental to their social order. If women harbored dark desires, if they wanted more than motherhood and matrimony, the entire structure of society came into question. Who would raise the children? Who would maintain domestic harmony? Who would embody moral virtue if not the angel in the house? Freud's work suggested that repression wasn't just unhealthy, it was impossible to maintain. Female desire, when pushed underground, didn't disappear. It transformed, emerged in symptoms, in dreams, in slips of the tongue. The unconscious always found a way to express what consciousness denied. This meant the Victorian solution, pretending. Female desire didn't exist, was doomed to failure. By the early 20th century, Freud's ideas had begun to spread beyond medical circles into popular culture. Writers, artists, and intellectuals engaged with his theories, often using them to challenge established norms. Women began questioning whether their discontent might stem not from personal failure, but from impossible social expectations. And the first whispers of sexual revolution had begun. But even as his ideas gained traction, they remained deeply controversial. Many preferred comfortable allusions to uncomfortable truths. It was easier to dismiss Freud as obsessed with sex than to confront what his work revealed about human nature, particularly female nature. The backlash wasn't just professional, it was existential, a desperate attempt to preserve a worldview threatened by his insights. What makes Freud's observations on female desire so enduring is that they continue to provoke discomfort today. Despite sexual liberation, feminist movements, and radical changes in gender roles, we still struggle to fully acknowledge the complexity of female desire. We've replaced Victorian repression with new forms of idealization and constraint. We still want female sexuality to be nice, predictable, and socially acceptable. Yet the clinical evidence Freud gathered told a different story, one of desire that doesn't always align with our values, that can be selfish, aggressive, or unexpected. This is the scandal that continues to resonate, that female desire might be fundamentally untamable, that it might contain elements we'd prefer not to see, and that denying this reality doesn't make it disappear. While Freud's theory of the male Oedipus complex gained reluctant acknowledgement, its female counterpart remains shrouded in deeper taboo. When Freud suggested that little boys desire their mothers and feel rivalry toward their fathers, society was uncomfortable but could somewhat rationalize it. But when he proposed that little girls experience similar dynamics with their parents, the backlash was immediate and fierce. The female Oedipus complex, which Freud later termed the Electra complex, describes a crucial phase in a girl's psychological development. According to Freud, between ages 3 and 6, the young girl develops an unconscious attachment to her father, while viewing her mother as a rival. This isn't just innocent daddy's girl affection. It's an erotic attachment that shapes her entire psychological landscape. What makes this theory so disturbing isn't just the suggestion of childhood sexuality. It's the implication that a girl's relationship with both parents contains elements of desire, jealousy, and competition that fundamentally shape her identity as a woman. This challenges our most sacred beliefs about childhood innocence and family dynamics. Freud observed that girls initially direct their libidinal energy toward their mothers, just as boys do. But a critical shift occurs when the girl realizes she lacks a penis, what Freud controversially called penis envy. This discovery leads to resentment toward the mother who failed to provide her with this organ, and a turn toward the father who possesses it. The girl's desire isn't merely for the father himself, but for what he represents: power, completeness, and the phallus she perceives herself as lacking. This psychological drama unfolds beneath conscious awareness, manifesting in behaviors parents often find endearing rather than alarming. the little girl who declares she'll marry daddy when she grows up, the child who competes for father's attention or displays jealousy when her parents show affection, the girl who alternates between adoring and resenting her mother without understanding why. Freud saw these not as cute phases, but as evidence of profound psychological processes that would shape adult female desire. The resolution of this complex isn't simple. Unlike boys, who resolve their Oedipal feelings through fear of castration, girls have no comparable mechanism to fully abandon their attachment to their fathers. Instead, they must gradually transform this desire into identification with the mother and redirection toward appropriate male figures. This incomplete resolution, Freud suggested, contributes to what he perceived as women's less fully developed superego, their moral compass. When presented with these ideas, Victorian society was outraged, and even today many find them deeply troubling. The suggestion that little girls harbor erotic feelings toward their fathers strikes at our deepest taboos. It's easier to dismiss Freud as a perverse old man than to consider that our earliest relationships might contain elements we'd rather not acknowledge. Moreover, Freud's theory implies that female development is fundamentally different from male development, not just physically but psychologically. The girl must not only transfer her desire from mother to father, but must eventually accept her castrated state and find satisfaction in motherhood rather than achievement. These conclusions were and remain deeply controversial, especially for those championing gender equality. Yet despite the discomfort, Freud's observations of his female patients repeatedly revealed patterns suggesting childhood dynamics continued to influence adult relationships. Women who could only love unavailable men, women drawn to father figures, women who sabotaged relationships that became too intimate, women caught in competitive relationships with their mothers well into adulthood. These patterns suggested early attachments cast long shadows. Modern psychoanalysts have significantly revised Freud's views, particularly rejecting his biological determinism and phallocentric perspective. Yet many maintain that early parent-child relationships do contain complex emotions that influence adult sexuality and relationships. The essence of Freud's insight, that childhood attachments shape adult desires, remains influential, even as specific details of his theory have been challenged. What remains most provocative about the female Oedipus complex isn't the specific mechanism Freud proposed, but the suggestion that female desire is shaped by complex psychological dynamics rather than simple biology or cultural conditioning. This contradicts both conservative views that female sexuality is naturally passive and maternal, and certain progressive views that gender differences in desire are entirely socially constructed. Freud's theory suggests something more unsettling, that desire emerges from an intricate dance between biology, family dynamics, and psychological development. This complexity means female desire can't be easily categorized, controlled, or predicted. It has its own internal logic, its own history, its own contradictions. This is precisely what makes it threatening. Even in our supposedly enlightened times, we struggle to acknowledge how early family dynamics shape adult sexuality. We prefer to believe desire emerges fully formed in adulthood, untainted by childhood experiences. The alternative, that our earliest relationships with parents influence who and how we desire, remains deeply uncomfortable. It's easier to dismiss Freud entirely than to engage with this possibility. Yet the psychological patterns Freud observed persist. Women who repeatedly choose partners resembling their fathers. Women caught in lifelong competition with their mothers. Women whose desires conflict with their conscious values. These patterns suggest that something about Freud's observations touched on an uncomfortable truth, even if his specific explanations were limited by his cultural context. The female Oedipus complex remains the taboo no one wants to discuss because it suggests female desire isn't just biological instinct or social programming, but emerges from the complex intersection of both, filtered through early emotional experiences that leave lasting imprints. This makes desire not just powerful but personal, rooted in individual history, rather than universal patterns, and that makes it infinitely harder to categorize, control, or judge. This is perhaps Freud's most enduring insight about female desire. Not that it follows specific patterns, but that it emerges from deep psychological roots unique to each woman's experience. The crucial truth isn't in the specific mechanisms he proposed, but in the recognition that desire is neither simple nor easily tamed. It is a force shaped by our earliest and most formative relationships, carrying echoes of attachments formed long before we had words to describe them. Of all Freud's theories about female desire, none has provoked more outrage than the concept of penis envy. The very phrase triggers immediate defensive reactions from ridicule to anger to dismissal. But what if we look beyond the provocative terminology to examine what Freud was actually observing in his female patients? Penis envy, in Freud's framework, isn't merely about anatomical jealousy. It represents something far more profound. A girl's first recognition of societal power dynamics encoded in physical difference. When the young girl discovers anatomical differences between genders, Freud proposed that she doesn't simply note this distinction. She perceives it as a lack and absence where something should be. This perception isn't innate, but shaped by a culture that privileges the masculine. What follows this discovery is a complex psychological journey. The girl blames her mother for her perceived castration and turns toward her father as the possessor of what she lacks. But this isn't just about physical organs. It's about what they symbolize: authority, freedom, potency, and social privilege. The penis becomes what psychoanalysts call a signifier, a physical representation of abstract power. This theory becomes particularly inflammatory because it suggests female desire isn't autonomous, but reactive, defined by absence rather than presence. It implies women's ambitions, achievements, and even motherhood might be compensatory mechanisms for this fundamental lack. For those fighting for gender equality, such suggestions were not just offensive, but politically dangerous. Yet, Freud wasn't simply theorizing in a vacuum. He observed patterns in his female patients, intense feelings of inadequacy that seemed disproportionate to their circumstances, competitive relationships with men that concealed unconscious envy, achievements pursued not for personal satisfaction, but to prove equality with men. These patterns suggested something beyond simple socialization was at work, something rooted in early psychological development. What makes penis envy so difficult to discuss even today is that it contains elements that resonate with many women's experiences while framing them in terms that seem reductive and biologically deterministic. Many women do recognize feeling disadvantaged in a male-dominated world. Many do experience complex feelings about their bodies and sexualities that aren't entirely explained by social conditioning. Many do struggle with unconscious competitive dynamics in their relationships with men. Modern analysts have reinterpreted penis envy not as literal envy of male anatomy, but as a symbolic representation of the girl's recognition that she belongs to the less privileged gender category. It's not the organ itself, but what it represents in a patriarchal society: greater freedom, authority, and possibility. This reframing maintains Freud's core insight that gender awareness creates profound psychological impacts while rejecting the biological determinism of his original formulation. Critics rightfully point out that Freud pathologized normal female development by defining it in terms of lack, rather than as a positive process with its own trajectory. His theory privileges the phallus as the universal standard against which both male and female development is measured. This phallocentrism reflects the biases of his Victorian era rather than universal psychological truth. Yet dismissing the concept entirely risks overlooking something important about female psychological development in patriarchal societies. Girls do observe gender-based power differences. They do internalize messages about their relative worth. They do develop complex psychological responses to these observations. The question isn't whether such processes occur, but how to understand them without reducing female experience to male reference terms. What's particularly threatening about penis envy isn't just its apparent sexism, but its implication that female desire is shaped by unconscious forces beyond rational control. It suggests women's conscious wishes might be influenced by unconscious patterns established in early childhood, that even the most liberated, self-aware woman might harbor desires, fears, and motivations she doesn't fully recognize or understand. This contradicts both conservative views that female desire is naturally maternal and modest, and progressive views that women can entirely transcend socialization through awareness and choice. Freud's theory suggests something more complex, that desire emerges from an interplay between biology, culture, and individual psychological development that can't be reduced to simple formulas. Perhaps the most valuable aspect of the penis envy concept is not its literal claims, but how it illuminates the relationship between desire and power. If desire forms in response to perceived lack, whether physical, emotional, or social, then female desire in patriarchal societies inevitably contains elements shaped by power imbalance. This doesn't mean female desire is essentially reactive, but that it develops under conditions that can't be separated from power relations. This insight remains relevant even as we reject the biological determinism of Freud's original theory. Female desire doesn't form in some abstract, power-neutral space. It emerges within social structures that still privilege masculine experience and authority. Understanding how power shapes desire, not just what we desire but how we desire, remains a crucial and often uncomfortable exploration. The inconvenient truth isn't that women envy male anatomy, but that female desire forms within social and psychological contexts that can't be separated from gender power dynamics. This is what makes penis envy worth revisiting, not as a literal theory about anatomical jealousy, but as a flawed yet provocative exploration of how power imbalances shape our most intimate feelings and desires. Among Freud's most controversial observations was the apparent prevalence of masochistic fantasies and behaviors in his female patients. While Victorian society preferred to imagine women as sexually passive creatures, Freud's clinical work revealed something more complex. Many women experienced pleasure in submission, humiliation, or even pain. This discovery wasn't just scandalous. It was profoundly confusing, even to Freud himself. What could explain the phenomenon of female masochism? Why would women, already disadvantaged in society, harbor desires for further subjugation? Freud's attempts to understand this paradox led him through several theoretical iterations, each more controversial than the last. Initially, Freud viewed masochism as a perversion, a deviation from normal sexual development. But as he encountered it repeatedly in patients who were otherwise psychologically healthy, he began to suspect it represented something more fundamental about female sexuality. In his 1924 paper, The Economic Problem of Masochism, he proposed that masochism might be intrinsically connected to femininity itself. The logic behind this troubling conclusion stemmed from Freud's observations of female development. The girl's turn from active to passive aims during the Oedipal phase, her acceptance of a castrated position, and her ultimate identification with her mother all required a certain surrender of autonomy. Freud suggested that this developmental trajectory might create a psychological foundation for masochistic tendencies. This theory provoked outrage, even among Freud's followers. It seemed to naturalize female submission, suggesting women were biologically programmed to desire their own subjugation. Critics argued that Freud was merely projecting cultural norms onto biology, interpreting socially conditioned behaviors as natural inclinations. If women appeared masochistic, they reasoned, it was because patriarchal society rewarded compliance and punished assertion. Yet Freud's clinical observations couldn't be easily dismissed. The women who sought his help weren't simply conforming to social expectations. They were struggling with desires that often contradicted their conscious values and intentions. Their masochistic fantasies weren't performed for male approval, but emerged from within, frequently causing them distress precisely because they conflicted with their conscious self-image. Modern understanding offers more nuanced interpretations. Rather than seeing masochism as inherently female, contemporary analysts view it as a complex psychological response that can emerge in anyone. It might represent an attempt to transform helplessness into control by voluntarily accepting what feels inevitable. It might serve as an unconscious form of self-punishment for forbidden desires. It might provide a temporary escape from the burden of autonomy and responsibility. What makes female masochism particularly charged is its apparent reinforcement of damaging social dynamics. When women desire submission in a society that already limits their power, it creates a troubling circular logic. Are these desires authentic expressions of female sexuality or internalized reflections of oppression? Can desire ever be separated from the power structures that shape it? Freud's most valuable insight wasn't that female masochism is natural or inevitable, but that desire often contains contradictions that can't be resolved through simple formulas of liberation. Women who consciously embrace feminist principles might still harbor fantasies of submission. Women who demand equality in their relationships might still experience pleasure in occasional surrender. These contradictions don't invalidate equality. They highlight the complex relationship between conscious values and unconscious desires. The difficult truth Freud exposed wasn't that women naturally desire submission, but that desire itself doesn't always align with our ideological commitments or rational interests. This creates a painful dilemma for many women. How to honor authentic desires while recognizing the social contexts that helped shape them. Is it possible to acknowledge masochistic desires without endorsing the power imbalances they seem to reflect? This question remains unresolved even in our supposedly sexually liberated era. Contemporary discussions of female sexuality still struggle to integrate observations about submission fantasies without sliding into either biological determinism or dismissing these desires as false consciousness. The prevalence of submission themes in female sexual fantasies, confirmed by numerous modern studies, remains a fact that neither conservative nor progressive narratives fully explain. What Freud recognized, and what continues to challenge us today, is that desire emerges from multiple sources, biological, psychological, cultural, that can't be neatly disentangled. The erotic isn't a pure space untouched by power relations, but is partially constituted by them. This doesn't mean desire is simply imposed from outside. Rather, it forms through complex interactions between internal and external forces. The enduring value of Freud's observations about female masochism isn't in his specific explanations, but in his willingness to confront the contradictions within desire itself. He recognized that liberation couldn't come through denying uncomfortable desires, but by understanding their origins and meanings. Only by acknowledging the complexity of desire, including its darkest and most troubling aspects, can we hope to develop truly authentic relationships with ourselves and others. When Freud began his career as a neurologist in the 1880s, hysteria was the diagnosis assigned to women exhibiting a bewildering array of symptoms: fainting spells, paralysis, sensory disturbances, uncontrollable crying and convulsions, all without apparent physical cause. Medical science of the time offered explanations ranging from wandering wombs to weak nerves to moral deficiency. Treatment consisted of rest cures, water therapies, and sometimes surgical removal of the ovaries. None addressed the true nature of these women's suffering. Freud's revolutionary insight wasn't just in recognizing hysteria as psychological rather than physical, but in identifying its specific source: repressed sexual desire. This connection between female sexuality and mental illness shocked Victorian society to its core. The idea that respectable women harbored powerful sexual urges so intense that their suppression could literally paralyze or blind them, contradicted everything society believed about female nature. Through his work with patients like Anna O., Elizabeth von R., and Dora, Freud observed a consistent pattern. These women had experienced sexual desires, thoughts, or experiences that were incompatible with their conscious self-image and social expectations. Unable to acknowledge these feelings consciously, they pushed them into the unconscious mind. But repression wasn't a perfect solution. The psychic energy of these desires remained active, converting into physical symptoms through a process Freud called conversion. This theory didn't just suggest women had sexual desires. It indicated these desires were so powerful that denying them could break the mind-body connection. The implications were profound. If female sexuality was strong enough to overcome neurological functioning when repressed, how powerful might it be when expressed? What might happen to social institutions built on assumptions of female sexual passivity if this force were acknowledged? Freud's early treatment method, which he called the talking cure, involved helping patients identify and verbalize repressed sexual material. As women spoke about forbidden desires, childhood sexual experiences, and repressed fantasies, their physical symptoms often improved or disappeared entirely. This therapeutic success suggested Freud had identified something fundamentally true about the relationship between repression and illness. What made this approach particularly threatening was its implication that good girls, women who most perfectly embodied Victorian ideals of purity and propriety, might be most vulnerable to hysteria, precisely because of their rigid adherence to these standards. The women most determined to repress their sexuality were those most likely to develop conversion symptoms. Virtue, in this framework, wasn't protecting women from illness, but potentially causing it. Freud's case histories revealed women whose conscious commitment to sexual propriety conflicted with unconscious desires they couldn't acknowledge. Elizabeth von R. developed leg pain that prevented her from walking after experiencing forbidden attraction to her brother-in-law. Dora's respiratory symptoms emerged amid a complex situation involving her father's mistress and the mistress's husband. These weren't simple cases of lust, but intricate psychological conflicts between desire and social prohibition. The medical establishment reacted with predictable hostility. Attributing physical symptoms to repressed sexuality seemed not just speculative but dangerous, a justification for sexual liberation that could undermine social order. If sexual repression caused illness, the logical conclusion was that sexual expression promoted health. This contradicted centuries of teaching that female virtue required strict control of desire. Yet Freud's observations couldn't be easily dismissed. Women who allowed themselves to acknowledge and verbalize their sexual thoughts and feelings often experienced relief from debilitating symptoms. This didn't necessarily mean acting on these desires. Simply acknowledging them could reduce their disruptive power. The unconscious required recognition, not necessarily gratification. The connection between hysteria and repressed desire frightened the world because it suggested something fundamentally unstable about the Victorian social order. If women's nature wasn't naturally passive and pure, but forcefully constrained against powerful internal drives, how secure was the system built on this constraint? What might happen if women began prioritizing psychological health over social conformity? This question remains relevant today. We've moved beyond Victorian sexual repression, yet women still navigate complex expectations around desire. Contemporary women may not develop conversion disorders like their Victorian counterparts, but many experience disconnection from their desires, conflict between sexual impulses and identities, and pressure to shape their sexuality to external expectations. The fundamental tension Freud identified between authentic desire and social acceptability persists in new forms. The uncomfortable truth Freud exposed wasn't just that women experience sexual desire, but that society's denial of this reality causes genuine suffering. The price of maintaining comforting illusions about female sexuality is paid in women's bodies and minds. This insight remains as challenging today as it was in Freud's time, forcing us to confront how cultural narratives about gender and sexuality impact psychological well-being.